The coffee had gone cold in my hands when I heard Rebecca's key in the front door, followed by the sound of her heels clicking against the marble entryway with that particular urgency that meant she was either furious or panicked. I didn't move from my chair in the sunroom where I'd been watching the morning light filter through the oak trees, still holding the pen I'd used to sign the final documents. The papers were spread across the glass table in front of me, each page representing years of careful planning, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that everything was finally in place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca's voice cut through the peaceful silence like a blade. Mother, we need to talk, now. I turned slowly, taking in her appearance. My daughter stood in the doorway wearing her charcoal business suit, the one she wore to important meetings, her auburn hair pulled back in that severe bun that made her look older than her 38 years. But it was her face that told me everything I needed to know. Her green eyes, so much like her father's, were wide with something between fear and rage, and her mouth was set in that thin line I remembered from her teenage years, when she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't have. In her trembling hand, she held a single sheet of paper, my letterhead. My handwriting. My name is Winnie Clark, and at 72 years old, I thought I had learned to expect the unexpected. I was wrong. The paper Rebecca clutched was indeed written in my hand, signed with my name, and dated just 3 days ago. But it wasn't what she thought it was, and the misunderstanding that followed would tear our family apart before bringing us closer than we'd ever been. Let me start from the beginning. 3 months earlier, when I first made the decision that would change everything. I had been sitting in Dr. Martinez's office on a Tuesday morning in September, listening to him explain the results of my latest cardiac evaluation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that familiar clinical glow that makes everything look slightly unreal. He was a kind man, Dr. Martinez, with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much, and he delivered the news with the practiced compassion of someone who had given similar diagnoses countless times before. Miss Clark, I want you to understand that this isn't an immediate emergency, he said, leaning forward in his chair and folding his hands on his desk. But the blockages we've found are significant. 80% in the left anterior descending artery, 65% in the right coronary. With your family history and the symptoms you've been experiencing, we need to discuss your options. I sat there in the burgundy leather chair, my purse clutched in my lap, and listened to him explain surgical procedures and medication regimens and lifestyle change. But what I heard underneath all the medical terminology was time, limited time, borrowed time, time to get my affairs in order. I had built Clark Industries from nothing, starting with a small textile import business in my garage 43 years ago after my husband David died in a construction accident, leaving me with a 3-year-old daughter and $1,700 in savings. Through decades of 18-hour days, calculated risks and more mistakes than I care to count, I had grown that garage operation into a company worth $47 million. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the stress of building something to secure my daughter's future might be the very thing that would keep me from seeing her enjoy it. Rebecca had never shown much interest in the business side of things. She was brilliant, certainly, with her MBA from Wharton, and her position as a senior partner at Kellerman & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious consulting firms, but she had always made it clear that she wanted to forge her own path, to build something that was entirely her. I respected that. I was proud of it, even, but it left me with a dilemma that had been keeping me awake at night for months. What do you do with a lifetime of work when the person you built it for doesn't want it? The answer came to me gradually, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I started paying attention to things I had been too busy to notice before. The homeless shelter downtown that struggled to keep its doors open each winter. The literacy program at the library that had to turn away adult learners because they couldn't afford more tutors. The after-school program in the low-income neighborhood where my first warehouse had been located, where kids waited on a list for months just to have a safe place to go when school ended. I began to see my money not as a legacy to be passed down but as a tool to be used, a tool that could change lives, create opportunities, build something lasting that would matter long after I was gone. The idea excited me in a way I hadn't felt since the early days of starting my company, when every decision mattered and every dollar counted. I spent weeks researching charities, visiting facilities, meeting with directors and volunteers and beneficiaries. I wanted to see where my money would go, to understand how it would be used, to make sure it would create real change rather than just padding administrative costs. It was during one of these visits, to a community center in East Hartford, that I met Maria Santos. Maria was 19 years old and 7 months pregnant, sitting in the center's small computer lab, trying to finish her GAD coursework before her baby arrived. She worked 2 part-time jobs, neither of which offered maternity leave, and she was living with her mother and 2 younger siblings in a 1-bedroom apartment. When I asked her what she planned to do after the baby came, she looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "I'll figure it out," she said simply. "I always do." That night, I went home to my 4-bedroom colonial in West Hartford, with its manicured lawn and 3-car garage and rooms I hadn't entered in months, and I knew what I needed to do. I called my attorney, Jonathan Reeves, first thing the next morning. Jonathan had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since my previous lawyer retired. He was thorough, discreet, and most importantly, he understood the difference between what was legally possible and what was morally right. When I explained what I wanted to do, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He didn't lecture me about family obligations or question my mental state. He simply asked the right questions and took careful notes. "You want to establish a foundation," he said, reviewing his legal pad, "with the bulk of your assets, including the business and all real estate holding. You want to retain enough to live comfortably for the remainder of your life, plus a modest inheritance for Rebecca, and you want this to be irrevocable." "That's correct. And you understand that once these papers are signed, you can't change your mind. The foundation will own Clark Industries. Your house will be donated. Your investment portfolio will be liquidated and transferred." "I understand." Jonathan studied me for a long moment. "Winnie, I have to ask, have you discussed this with Rebecca?" That was the question I had been dreading. The truth was, I hadn't told Rebecca anything about my heart condition, about the doctor's warnings, about the sleepless nights I'd been spending thinking about mortality and legacy and the weight of money that sits unused while people suffer. Rebecca was busy with her own life, her own career, her own carefully constructed world where problems were solved with spreadsheets and strategic planning. How could I explain that I wanted to give away everything she had assumed would one day be hers? "Rebecca has her own career, her own success," I told Jonathan. "She doesn't need this money, but there are people who do." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I'll draft the documents, but Winnie, I strongly recommend that you have a conversation with her before you sign anything. Surprises like this have a way of damaging relationships that can't always be repaired." I promised him I would think about it, and I did. I thought about it every day for the next 6 weeks as Jonathan prepared the foundation paperwork, as I met with charity administrators, and developed grant criteria, as I slowly and quietly began the process of dismantling the empire I had spent 4 decades building. But every time I picked up the phone to call Rebecca, I hesitated. Every time I started to bring it up during our weekly dinners, I changed the subject. I told myself I was protecting her, giving her time to focus on her own life without the distraction of worrying about mine. But the truth was simpler and more shameful than that. I was a coward. Rebecca had always been strong-willed. Even as a child, she had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them. She had argued with me about business decisions when she was in college, questioned my choices about everything from the charities I supported to the men I dated after her father died. She cared deeply, sometimes too deeply, and she wasn't good at hiding her feelings when she thought I was making a mistake. I knew she would try to talk me out of it. I knew she would worry about my health, about my financial security, about whether I was thinking clearly. I knew she would see my decision as a rejection of her, as a statement that I didn't trust her to use the money wisely, or that I didn't love her enough to want her to have. None of that was true, but I also knew that explaining my real motivations would require conversations about mortality and purpose, and the weight of accumulated wealth that we had never had before. So I took the coward's way out. I made my decision in private, signed my papers in secret, and planned to tell her afterward, when it was too late for arguments, or negotiations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, or the kind of painful honesty that sometimes damages relationships more than silence does. The final signing was scheduled for a Friday morning in November. Jonathan had arranged for all the necessary documents to be ready, all the transfers to be executed simultaneously, all the legal details to be handled with the efficiency that had made him one of the state's most respected estate attorneys. I woke up that morning feeling lighter than I had in months, knowing that by the end of the day, $43 million would begin flowing to organizations that could use it to change lives. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue dress that Rebecca had bought me for my birthday, and the pearl necklace that had been her grandmother's. I wanted to look like myself, like the person Rebecca knew and loved when I finally told her what I had done. I had planned to call her as soon as I returned from Jonathan's office, to invite her to dinner so we could have the conversation I should have initiated months earlier. But Rebecca had other plans. She had a key to my house, of course. She had insisted on it after I turned 70, worrying about what would happen if I fell, or had a medical emergency and couldn't get to the door. I had given it to her reluctantly, valuing my independence and privacy, but I understood her concern. I had been the same way when my own mother reached a certain age, needing to know that I could reach her if necessary. What I hadn't considered was that she might use that key to check on me when I didn't answer my phone for 24 hours. I had turned my phone off during the signing ceremony, wanting to focus completely on the moment, on the significance of what I was doing. When I returned home, I was emotionally drained from the morning's events, and the weight of the secret I had been carrying. I made myself a cup of tea, sat in the sunroom where the afternoon light was warmest, and decided to rest for an hour before making the call that would change everything between Rebecca and me. I must have fallen asleep in my chair, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I could hear Rebecca's key in the lock. She had found the papers on the table where I had left them the night before, the foundation documents, with their official seals and legal language, the transfer agreements for the business and the real estate, the irrevocable trust documents that would ensure the money would be used exactly as I intended. And on top of the stack, written in my own hand on my personal stationery, was the letter I had composed to accompany the legal document. A letter that began, "By the time you read this, everything will be final, and there will be no way to undo what I have done." A letter that discussed my reasons for giving away my fortune, my thoughts about legacy and purpose, my hope that she would understand and forgive me for not including her in the decision. A letter that, taken out of context and read by a daughter who had been worried about her mother's health and emotional state, could very easily be misinterpreted as something much darker than a financial disclosure. Now Rebecca stood in my sunroom doorway, holding that letter in her trembling hand, her face a mixture of fear and fury and something that looked dangerously close to grief. "Mother," she said again, her voice barely controlled, "what the hell is I looked at her, at the paper in her hand, at the expression on her face, and realized that my careful planning had overlooked one crucial detail. I had prepared for Rebecca's anger about my financial decision. I had prepared for her concerns about my judgment, and her questions about my motivations. I had not prepared for her to think I was planning to kill myself. "Rebecca," I said slowly, setting down my teacup and rising from my chair, "I can explain." But the look in her eyes told me that explanation was going to be much more complicated than I had anticipated, because in her mind, she wasn't looking at her mother's charitable giving documents, she was looking at a suicide note, and she had already decided what she needed to do about it. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, casting long shadows across the room where my daughter and I faced each other across a misunderstanding that would change both of our lives forever. I had thought the hardest part would be telling her about the money. I was about to learn that the hardest part would be convincing her to let me give it away. Rebecca moved into the room like a prosecutor approaching a hostile witness, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with military precision. She set the letter down on the glass table with exaggerated care, as if it were evidence in a crime scene, and turned to face me with the kind of controlled fury I hadn't seen since she was 16 and caught me reading her diary. "Sit down, Mother," she said, and there was something in her tone that made me bristle. It was the voice she used with difficult clients, the one that brooked no argument and expected immediate compliance. It was not the voice a daughter should use with her mother, but I sensed that pointing this out would only escalate a situation that was already spiraling beyond my control. I remained standing. Rebecca, if you would just let me explain what those documents actually are. I know what they are, she interrupted, picking up the letter again and holding it like an accusation. This is a goodbye note, Mother. You're talking about giving away everything. About how there's no way to undo what you've done. About how you hope I'll understand someday. Do you think I'm stupid? The word stupid hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Rebecca had always been sensitive about her intelligence, perhaps because she had grown up watching me navigate business deals and corporate negotiations without the benefit of the college education she had worked so hard to achieve. She had spent her adult life proving that she was smarter, more educated, more sophisticated than the woman who had raised her in the back room of a textile warehouse. Now she was using that intelligence to construct a narrative that was both logical and completely wrong. I think you're jumping to conclusions, I said carefully. Those papers aren't what you think they are, really? She picked up one of the legal documents and began reading aloud. The irrevocable transfer of all assets belonging to Winifred Clark to the newly established Clark Foundation for the purpose of charitable distribution. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Revocable, Mother. That means permanent. That means you can't change your mind. That means by the time anyone finds this, it's too late to stop you. I felt a chill run through me as I began to understand how she was interpreting the language. To Rebecca, trained to read legal documents for hidden meanings and potential liabilities, the foundation paperwork looked like a sophisticated form of estate planning designed to take effect immediately upon my death. The timing, the secrecy, the finality of the transfers, all of it supported her theory that I was planning something irreversible and tragic. Rebecca, you're misunderstanding. Am I? She set the document down and picked up my handwritten letter again. Let me read you some more of your own words, Mother. I know this will come as a shock and I know you'll be angry that I didn't discuss it with you first, but I needed to do this on my own terms in my own time, without interference or attempts to change my mind. She looked up at me, her voice breaking slightly. What else could that possibly mean? I opened my mouth to answer but she held up her hand to stop me. There's more. I've been thinking about this for months, ever since the diagnosis. I can't bear the thought of being a burden, of watching everything I've worked for slowly deteriorate while I become someone I don't recognize. Rebecca's voice was shaking now. What diagnosis, Mother? What aren't you telling me? The word diagnosis hit me like a physical blow. In my letter, I had been referring to Dr. Martinez's evaluation of my heart condition, the blockages that would require careful monitoring and possibly surgery in the coming years. It was serious but manageable. Certainly not life-threatening in the immediate future, but taken in the context Rebecca was creating, it sounded like something much worse. It sounded terminal. It's my heart, I said quickly. Just some blockages. Dr. Martinez says it's manageable with medication and— Stop lying to me. Rebecca's composure finally cracked and she was shouting now, her voice echoing off the windows and the high ceiling. I know what this is. I know what you're planning, and I'm not going to let you do it. She pulled out her cell phone and began dialing with quick, angry movement. I reached for her arm, trying to stop her, but she stepped away from me and held the phone to her ear. Yes, this is Rebecca Clark. I need to report a potential suicide threat. My mother has left a note, and I believe she's in immediate danger. The word suicide seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I stared at Rebecca in shock, unable to process that my careful, rational daughter was calling 911 because she thought I was planning to kill myself. The irony was almost laughable. I had given away my fortune specifically because I wanted to live to see it used for good, because I wanted to spend my remaining years watching the positive impact it would have on people's lives. But Rebecca couldn't see past her own fear and her assumption that my secrecy meant something sinister. Rebecca, hang up the phone, I said as firmly as I could manage. You're making a mistake. But she was already giving my address to the dispatcher, already explaining that she had found a note and legal documents that suggested her mother was planning to harm herself. She was being thorough, efficient, protective, all the qualities that made her excellent at her job, and that were now working against both of us. When she finally hung up, we stared at each other across a silence that felt like a chasm, the damage was done. Within minutes my house would be full of paramedics and police officers, and crisis counselors, all summoned to prevent a tragedy that existed only in my daughter's imagination. My private decision to give away my money had become a public spectacle, and there would be no way to undo the humiliation and scrutiny that was about to descend on both of us. "Why couldn't you just trust me?" Rebecca asked, and her voice was small now, like a child. "Why couldn't you tell me what was wrong? I could have helped you. We could have figured something out together." Looking at her face, at the genuine fear and love and desperation in her eyes, I finally understood the magnitude of my mistake. It wasn't just that I had failed to explain my charitable giving plans, it was that I had kept so many secrets about my health, about my financial planning, about my thoughts and fears and hopes for the future, that Rebecca had been forced to construct her own explanations for my behavior. And those explanations, filtered through her own anxieties about losing the only parent she had left, had led her to the worst possible conclusion. "I was trying to protect you," I said weakly, knowing how inadequate the words sounded. "Protect me from what? From knowing that you're sick, from having a say in decisions that affect both of us, from being able to help you." She shook her head, and I could see the anger building again underneath the fear. "You don't get to make that choice for me, Mother. You don't get to decide that I'm too fragile or too selfish or too whatever to handle the truth." She was right, of course. I had made assumptions about how she would react, about what she could handle, about what kind of daughter she was and what kind of mother I should be. I had tried to control the narrative, to manage her emotions, to spare both of us from difficult conversations that might have prevented this exact scenario from unfolding. The sound of sirens in the distance made us both free. They were still several blocks away, but they were getting closer, and soon my quiet street would be filled with emergency vehicles and neighbors coming out to see what was wrong. Soon my private life would become public, my financial decisions would be scrutinized, and my relationship with Rebecca would be forever changed by this morning's misunderstanding. "They're coming," Rebecca said, unnecessarily, and I could hear relief in her voice. She genuinely believed she was saving my life, that the paramedics and crisis counselors would be able to talk me out of whatever desperate plan she thought I had made. She couldn't see that the only thing threatening my life was her interpretation of documents she didn't fully understand. "Rebecca," I said urgently, knowing I only had a few minutes before we would be separated, and questioned and treated like participants in a crisis neither of us had created. "Please listen to me. Those papers aren't a suicide note. They're charitable giving documents. I was planning to call you today to explain everything. I'm not planning to hurt myself. I'm planning to give away my money to help other people." She looked at me skeptically, as if this explanation was just another layer of deception designed to throw her off the trail. "Then why all the secrecy? Why the dramatic language about irrevocable decisions and hoping I'll understand someday?" "Because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it," I admitted. "Because I knew you'd think I was being foolish or impulsive, or that I wasn't thinking clearly. Because I wanted to make the decision on my own terms, without having to justify or defend, or negotiate every detail." The sirens were louder now, probably turning onto our street. Rebecca glanced toward the front of the house, then back at me, and I could see the uncertainty in her face. Part of her wanted to believe me, wanted to accept that this was all a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple explanation. But another part of her, the part that had been terrified by the language in my letter and the implications of the legal documents, wasn't ready to let go of her interpretation. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then you can explain it to them when they get here. You can show them the foundation paperwork, and prove that this is just a financial decision and not something else." I nodded, because what else could I do? In a few minutes, my house would be invaded by well-meaning professionals who would treat me like a potential suicide victim until I could convince them otherwise. My neighbors would whisper about what they had seen, my financial affairs would be scrutinized, and Rebecca and I would have to rebuild our relationship from the rubble of this morning's catastrophe. But as the first emergency vehicle pulled into my driveway, I realized that maybe this was exactly what we needed. Maybe the crisis Rebecca had created would force us to have the honest conversations we should have been having all along. Maybe the public nature of this misunderstanding would strip away the polite distances and careful silences that had been keeping us from really knowing each other. Or maybe it would destroy what was left of our relationship and leave us both with wounds that would never fully heal. Either way, I was about to find out. The paramedics arrived first, followed closely by a police cruiser and what appeared to be a crisis intervention specialist in an unmarked sedan. I watched through the sunroom windows as they gathered on my front lawn, consulting their clipboards and radios with the efficient choreography of professionals who had done this many times before. My neighbors began emerging from their houses, Miss Patterson from next door in her bathrobe, the young couple across the street stepping onto their porch with coffee mugs in hand, all of them drawn by the magnetic pull of emergency vehicles and the promise of drama breaking the monotony of a quiet Friday morning. Rebecca met them at the door before they could ring the bell, her voice carrying clearly through the house as she explained the situation with the same crisp efficiency she brought to her business presentation. I heard fragments of her words, found a note, giving away everything, afraid she might hurt herself, each phrase landing like a physical blow as I realized how deeply she had misunderstood my intention. The lead paramedic was a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that had seen enough genuine crises to recognize manufactured ones. She introduced herself as Linda Rodriguez and asked if she could sit down with me to talk about what was happening. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that suggested she wasn't easily fooled but also wasn't looking for a fight. "Mrs. Clark, your daughter is very worried about you. She found some documents and a letter that concerned her enough to call for help. Can you tell me how you're feeling today?" I looked around my sunroom, at the emergency personnel now filling my home, at Rebecca hovering near the doorway with her arms crossed defensively, and felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. These people had invaded my private space because my daughter had decided she knew better than I did what my own words meant. They were treating me like a fragile old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life, and the presumption of it made my chest tight with indignation. "I'm feeling confused," I said honestly, confused about why trained medical professionals would respond to a charitable giving announcement as if it were a mental health crisis. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly. "A charitable giving announcement? That's what this is about. I've established a foundation and donated the majority of my assets to various charities. My daughter found the paperwork and apparently decided that philanthropy is evidence of suicidal ideation." I watched Linda process this information, her eyes moving between me and Rebecca, who had stepped fully into the room now and was shaking her head with visible frustration. "That's not what this is about," Rebecca said sharply. "Show her the letter, Mother. Show her what you actually wrote." Linda held out her hand, and Rebecca placed my handwritten note in it with the careful precision of someone presenting evidence in court. I watched Linda read it, her expression neutral but attentive, and found myself seeing my own words through the lens of Rebecca's interpretation for the first time. Written in the emotional aftermath of finalizing the foundation documents, the letter did sound ominous when taken out of context. The references to irrevocable decisions, to doing things on my own terms without interference, to not wanting to be a burden, all of it could easily be read as the words of someone preparing for a permanent goodbye rather than a financial restructuring. "Mrs. Clark," Linda said carefully, "I can see how this might be interpreted in different ways. Can you help me understand what you meant by some of these phrases?" Over the next 20 minutes, I found myself dissecting my own motivations and word choices for an audience of strangers who had been summoned to prevent a crisis that existed only in my daughter's imagination. Martinez's diagnosis about my decision to establish the foundation, about my desire to see my money used for good while I was still alive to witness its impact. I showed them the legal documents, pointed out the foundation's mission statement, even called Jonathan Reeves to confirm that everything I was saying was true. But even as the evidence mounted in my favor, I could see skepticism lingering in Rebecca's face. She had constructed a narrative that made emotional sense to her: an aging mother with health problems, acting secretively and making dramatic financial decisions, writing letters about irrevocable choices, and she wasn't ready to abandon that narrative just because the facts didn't support it. Even if that's what you intended, Rebecca said when Linda asked if she had any remaining concerns, the behavior is still worrying. Giving away $47 million without discussing it with family, writing cryptic letters, being secretive about medical diagnoses, these aren't the actions of someone who's thinking clearly. The word clearly hung in the air like an accusation. Rebecca was suggesting, politely but unmistakably, that I wasn't competent to make decisions about my own money, my own life, my own future. She was questioning my mental state in front of strangers, using the very concern and love she felt for me as weapons to undermine my autonomy. Linda looked between us again, clearly recognizing that this was more complicated than a simple misunderstanding about paperwork. Mrs. Clark, are you currently under any kind of medical care for depression or anxiety? Have you been having thoughts of hurting yourself? No, I said firmly. I see Dr. Martinez for my heart condition, which is serious but manageable. I'm not depressed. I'm not suicidal. I'm a woman who has decided to give away her money to help other people, and apparently that decision is so incomprehensible to my daughter that she's decided I must be mentally ill. The harshness of my words surprised even me, but I was tired of being treated like a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own affairs. Rebecca's face flushed red, and I could see tears forming in her eyes, but I didn't soften my tone. This conversation needed to happen, and it needed to happen with witnesses who could confirm that I was lucid, rational, and capable of making my own decisions. I understand that this is difficult for both of you, Linda said diplomatically. Miss Clark, from what I can see, you're not in immediate danger, and you seem to understand the nature and consequences of your financial decisions. But I'm also hearing that there's been a breakdown in communication between you and your daughter that has led to some very serious misunderstanding. She turned to Rebecca. Ms. Clark, I can see how frightening it would be to find that letter without context, but it seems clear that your mother isn't planning to hurt herself. The question now is whether you can work together to rebuild the trust that's been damaged by this situation. Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I just don't understand why she couldn't trust me enough to tell me what she was planning. We have dinner every week. We talk almost every day, but she hides a heart condition from me, secretly gives away everything she owns, and then acts like I'm the one being unreasonable for being concerned. Her voice broke on the last word, and I felt a stab of guilt pierce through my anger. Rebecca wasn't wrong to be hurt by my secrecy. I had shut her out of major decisions that affected both of our lives, and I had done it not out of necessity, but out of my own fear of confrontation and my own need to control the narrative. Rebecca, I said more gently, I wasn't trying to hurt. I was trying to protect you from having to make difficult decisions, from having to worry about my health, from having to feel guilty about money you never asked for in the first place. But those aren't your decisions to make. The words burst out of her with surprising force. You don't get to decide what I can handle or what I should worry about. You don't get to protect me from reality, just because you think it might be unpleasant. I'm not a child anymore, Mother. I'm a grown woman with my own life and my own ability to process difficult information. She was right, of course, and hearing her articulate it so clearly made me realize how patronizing my behavior had been. I had treated her like someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who deserved to be included. I had made assumptions about her values, her priorities, her capacity for understanding complex emotional and financial decisions. Linda stood up, apparently satisfied that there was no immediate crisis to manage. Ms. Clark, I'm going to recommend that you follow up with your primary care physician about your heart condition and that you consider speaking with a counselor about the communication issues you and your daughter are experiencing. Ms. Clark, I think it would be beneficial for you to have some professional support as you process this situation as well. She handed each of us a card with crisis hotline numbers and community resources, then gathered her equipment and headed for the door. The police officer who had been taking notes in the background followed her, as did the crisis counselor who had arrived but barely spoken throughout the entire encounter. Within minutes the emergency vehicles were gone, my neighbors had retreated to their houses, and Rebecca and I were left alone in my sunroom, with the wreckage of our relationship scattered between us like broken glass. "I can't believe you called 911, I said into the silence. "I can't believe you gave away $47 million without telling me," Rebecca replied. We stared at each other across a distance that felt much wider than the few feet of space between our chairs. I could see the exhaustion in Rebecca's face, the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of the morning's drama, and I recognized the same tiredness in myself. We were both depleted by the emotional intensity of the last few hours, both struggling to understand how a simple misunderstanding had escalated into such a public spectacle. "We need to talk," Rebecca said finally. "Really about your health, about the foundation, about why you felt like you couldn't trust me with any of this." I nodded, knowing she was right, but dreading the conversation that was coming. We had spent years maintaining a careful politeness with each other, discussing safe topics, and avoiding the deeper questions that might lead to conflict or uncomfortable revelation. Now we were going to have to strip away all of that protective distance and confront the assumptions and resentments that had been building between us for longer than either of us wanted to admit. "I'll make coffee," I said, getting up from my chair on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. "I'll help," Rebecca said, and her voice was softer now, less accusatory. We moved through my kitchen in careful coordination, she reaching for mugs while I measured coffee grounds, both of us grateful for the mundane task that gave us something to do with our hands, while we figured out where to begin. The normalcy of it, mother and daughter making coffee together on a Friday morning, felt almost surreal after the chaos of the last few hours. "Start with your heart," Rebecca said, as she poured cream into her mug. "When did you find out? What exactly did the doctor say? And why didn't you tell me?" I took a deep breath and began with Dr. Martinez's appointment, 3 months earlier, walking her through the diagnosis, the treatment options, the lifestyle changes I would need to make. I watched her face as I spoke, seeing the hurt and fear there, the way she flinched when I mentioned the word blockage, and the percentage of arterial narrowing. "It's not immediately life-threatening," I assured her. "Dr. Martinez thinks I have years, possibly decades if I take care of myself." But it was a wake-up call. It made me start thinking about how I wanted to spend whatever time I have left. "And you decided you wanted to spend it giving away money," Rebecca said, and there was something in her tone I couldn't quite identify. Not anger exactly, but not acceptance either. "I decided I wanted to spend it making a difference." "Rebecca, do you have any idea how much $47 million can do if it's used thoughtfully? How many lives it can change? How many problems it can solve?" "I know exactly how much good that money can do," Rebecca said quietly. "But I also know that it represents a lifetime of work for you. 43 years of building something from nothing, of sacrificing and struggling and fighting for every dollar, and you're just giving it away to strangers." The word strangers stung more than I expected it to. "They're not strangers, Rebecca. They're people who need help. People like Maria Santos, who's 19 and pregnant and trying to finish her GED while working 2 jobs. People like the kids at the after-school program, who don't have anywhere safe to go when school ends. People whose lives could be completely transformed by access to education or healthcare, or housing assistance." "What about my life?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper, but it hit me like a shout. "What about transforming my life, or my children's lives, or my grandchildren's lives? What about the family you actually know and love instead of the theoretical people you want to help?" I stared at her, finally understanding the real source of her anger. This wasn't just about poor communication or hurt feelings, or fear for my mental health. This was about money, about inheritance, about the future she had imagined for herself and her family. This was about the fact that I had given away her security without asking her permission. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "you have your own career, your own success. You don't need this money." "That's not the point," she said, and her voice was rising again. "The point is that it was mine. Not legally, maybe, but in every other way that matters. I grew up in that business. I spent my childhood weekends in warehouses, and my teenage summers, filing invoices, and my college breaks, learning about import regulations. I watched you build Clark Industries from nothing, and I always assumed that someday it would be mine to continue or sell, or do whatever I wanted. She set her coffee mug down hard enough to make it ring against the granite countertop. I never asked you for anything, Mother. I never demanded money or expected you to support my lifestyle or tried to influence your business decisions. But I also never imagined that you would give away my inheritance to people you've known for 5 minutes, while I was sitting right here, watching and waiting, and assuming that you trusted me enough to include me in decisions that affect my future. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt something twist in my chest as I realized how completely I had misunderstood her relationship with my money and my business. I had seen her lack of interest in day-to-day operations as evidence that she didn't want the responsibility of ownership. I had interpreted her independent career path as a rejection of the legacy I had built, but she had been waiting, not rejecting, watching, not ignoring, assuming that when the time came, I would offer her the choice of what to do with the empire I had spent my lifetime creating. I thought you wanted to build your own success, I said weakly. I did. I do, but that doesn't mean I wanted you to erase the option of inheriting your. There's a difference between choosing not to take over the family business and having that business given away without your knowledge or consent. She was right, and the realization made me feel sick with regret. I had been so focused on my own desire to do good with my money that I had completely ignored Rebecca's right to have a voice in how that money was used. I had made unilateral decisions about assets that represented not just my work, but her childhood, her history, her connection to the father she had lost, and the woman who had raised her. I'm sorry, I said, and the words felt inadequate but necessary. I should have talked to you. I should have included you in the decision-making process. I should have at least given you the chance to tell me how you felt about it before I made it irreversible. Rebecca nodded, wiping at her eyes again. I wouldn't have tried to stop you from being generous, Mother. If you had explained about Maria Santos and the after-school program, and all the other people you want to help, I would have supported that. But I would have wanted to be part of the conversation. I would have wanted to help you figure out how to balance philanthropy with family responsibility. What do you mean? I mean, there are ways to be incredibly generous without giving away everything. You could have kept the business and used the profits for charitable giving. You could have established a foundation with a portion of your assets and left the rest to family. You could have created a structure that would allow me to continue your philanthropic work after you're gone, so that your values and your mission would live on through someone who actually knows you and loves you. As she spoke, I began to see the possibilities I had missed in my rush to give everything away. I had been thinking in absolute terms: keep the money or give it away, help strangers or help family, when there might have been ways to do both. Ways to honor my desire to make a difference while also honoring Rebecca's connection to the business and the legacy I had built. Is it too late? I asked. The papers are signed. The transfers are in motion. Jonathan said it was irrevocable. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the legal and financial implications of what I had done. It might be, but there are sometimes ways to modify charitable giving structures, especially if there are questions about the donor's capacity or if family members contest the transfer. The fact that you didn't discuss this with anyone, the way you handled the documentation, the timing around your medical diagnosis, there might be grounds for review. Hope flickered in my chest, followed immediately by worry. You're not going to try to have me declared incompetent, are you? No, Rebecca said firmly. I was angry enough to consider it this morning, but I can see that you knew exactly what you were doing. You made a considered decision based on your own values and priority. I disagree with how you went about it, and I think you ignored important considerations, but I don't question your mental capacity. She paused, looking out the window at the street where emergency vehicles had been parked just an hour earlier. But I am going to ask you to consider undoing some of what you've done, not all of it, not the charitable giving itself, but the structure, the secrecy, the finality that cuts me out of your life and your legacy. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we start over, that we approach this as partners instead of as two people making unilateral decisions about shared interests. I'm proposing that you teach me about the charities you've chosen,
and the people you want to help, and I'll help you figure out how to maximize the impact of your giving, while still maintaining some connection to the business you've built and the daughter you've raised.
It was a reasonable request, more generous than I probably deserved given how I had handled the situation. But it also meant admitting that my carefully planned foundation structure had been flawed from the beginning, that my desire for control had led me to make decisions that weren't in anyone's best interest. "I'll call Jonathan," I said. "I'll ask him to review the documents and see what options we have for modification." Rebecca smiled for the first time since she had walked into my house that morning, and the relief in her face made me realize how much courage it had taken for her to confront me about something that mattered so deeply to her. "Thank you," she said. "And Mother, next time you get a scary medical diagnosis or decide to restructure your entire financial life, please just tell me. I'm stronger than you think I am, and I love you more than you seem to realize." The tears that had been threatening all morning finally spilled over, and I reached across the kitchen island to take her hand. "I love you too, sweetheart, and I'm sorry I forgot that love means trusting people with the truth, even when it's complicated or frightening or might lead to difficult conversation." We sat there holding hands across my granite countertop, mother and daughter learning how to be honest with each other for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit. Outside, the neighborhood had returned to its normal Friday morning quiet, with no trace of the emergency vehicles that had turned my private crisis into a public spectacle. But inside my kitchen, everything had changed. The foundation documents were still signed, the money was still transferred, and the legal complications were still formidable. But for the first time since Dr. Martinez had delivered his diagnosis 3 months earlier, I wasn't facing the future alone. Rebecca and I would figure out how to untangle the mess I had created, how to balance philanthropy with family responsibility, how to turn my impulsive decision into something that served everyone's interests. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more lawyers, more paperwork, and probably more tears, but we would face it together, and that made all the difference. The coffee had gone cold while we talked, but neither of us moved to reheat it. We had more important things to discuss, plans to make, relationships to rebuild. The morning that had started with emergency vehicles and accusations of mental illness was ending with the kind of honest communication Rebecca and I should have been having all along. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear Dr. Martinez's voice reminding me that stress was bad for my heart condition. But for the first time in months, I wasn't stressed, I was hopeful. And that, I thought, was much better medicine than anything he could prescribe. Jonathan Reeves sounded tired when he answered his phone at 11:30 that Friday night. I had been debating whether to call him so late, but the conversation with Rebecca had left me unable to sleep, my mind racing through possibilities and complications that seemed to multiply every time I tried to organize them into something manageable. "Winnie, is everything all right? You sound upset." I gave him a condensed version of the morning's events, watching Rebecca's face as I described the emergency response and the misunderstanding that had led to it. She had insisted on staying for this conversation, settling into my living room with a legal pad and her reading glasses, looking every inch the corporate consultant she had trained herself to become. "I see," Jonathan said when I finished, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "And now you want to know what options you have for modifying the foundation structure." "That's right. Rebecca has made some valid points about family inclusion and long-term sustainability. I'm wondering if there's a way to restructure things that would address her concerns while still maintaining the charitable mission." There was a long pause, and I could picture Jonathan in his home office, probably surrounded by case files and legal texts, calculating the implications of what I was asking him to do. "Winnie, I have to be honest with you. The documents we signed yesterday were designed to be permanent. Irrevocable means exactly that. Once the transfers are complete, they can't be undone through normal channels. However, there are some limited circumstances under which charitable transfers can be challenged or modified." Rebecca leaned forward, her pen poised over the legal pad. "What kind of circumstances?" "Well, if there were questions about the donor's mental capacity at the time of signing, or if there was evidence of undue influence, or if the donor wasn't fully informed about the consequences of the transfer. There's also something called the doctrine of Cypress, which allows courts to modify charitable gifts when the original purpose becomes impossible or impractical to fulfill. I felt a chill run through me. Are you suggesting that we claim I wasn't mentally competent when I signed those papers? No, absolutely not. From everything I observed, you were completely lucid and understood exactly what you were doing. But the circumstances this morning, the emergency response, the family crisis, the breakdown in communication, those suggest that maybe the decision-making process wasn't as thorough as it should have been. Rebecca was taking notes now, her handwriting neat and precise. What would we need to prove? That's where it gets complicated. We'd need to demonstrate either that Winnie wasn't fully informed about alternatives, or that the current structure doesn't actually serve her charitable intentions as effectively as a modified structure would. It's not impossible, but it would require going to court, and there's no guarantee of success. I closed my eyes, imagining the public scrutiny that would come with a legal challenge to my own charitable giving. The foundation had already been announced in the local business journal, and several of the recipient organizations had issued press releases thanking me for my generosity. Reversing course now would make me look unstable at best, manipulative at worst. What about a different approach? Rebecca asked. What if we don't challenge the existing transfers but instead modify the foundation structure going forward? Could Mother establish some kind of family oversight or create mechanisms for ongoing involvement? Jonathan was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him typing on his computer. That's actually a much more feasible option. Foundation bylaws can be amended, board structures can be modified, and advisory committees can be established. The money that's already been transferred would stay with the foundation, but the governance structure could be changed to include family members. Relief flooded through. This felt like a solution that could honor both my charitable intentions and Rebecca's desire to be included in decisions about our family legacy. What would that look like practically? I asked. Well, you could restructure the foundation board to include Rebecca as a voting member. You could establish policies that require family consultation for major grants or strategic decisions. You could even create a mechanism for the foundation to purchase back certain assets, like the business itself, if circumstances change in the future. Rebecca was writing furiously now, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed the possibilities Jonathan was describing. There's one other option we should consider, Jonathan continued. Instead of trying to undo what's already been done, you could establish a second, complementary foundation that would be jointly managed by you and Rebecca. This new foundation could focus on different charitable areas, or could serve as a vehicle for ongoing family philanthropy. Using what money? I asked. I've already transferred everything. Not everything. You retained enough assets to live comfortably for the rest of your life, remember? Plus there are still some liquid investments that haven't been transferred yet, and Rebecca could contribute her own resources if she wanted to be a true partner in the philanthropic effort. I looked at Rebecca, trying to gauge her reaction to this suggestion. The idea of her using her own money to support charitable causes I had chosen felt presumptuous, but I also recognized that it might be exactly the kind of partnership she had been hoping for. I'd be interested in that, Rebecca said slowly. Not just contributing money, but actually being involved in the decision-making process, learning about the organizations Mother has chosen, maybe identifying additional causes that align with our family values. That could work, Jonathan said. It would give you both a fresh start with the philanthropic work while leaving the existing foundation structure intact. Plus, it would demonstrate that the original transfers were made with sound judgment and clear charitable intent, which would protect against any future challenges. We spent another hour working through the details of what this partnership might look like. Rebecca would take a leave of absence from her consulting firm to spend several months learning about the charitable sector and the organizations I had already committed to supporting. Together we would visit programs, meet with beneficiaries, and develop criteria for future giving. Eventually she would take on increasing responsibility for the day-to-day management of both foundations, allowing me to step back gradually while ensuring that the work would continue after I was gone. It wasn't the neat, simple solution I had originally envisioned when I decided to give away my money in secret, but it was better than that. It was a solution that acknowledged the complexity of family relationships and the importance of including the people you love in decisions that affect their lives. When we finally hung up with Jonathan, Rebecca and I sat in my living room surrounded by pages of notes and the remnants of the Chinese takeout we had ordered for dinner. The crisis of the morning felt like it had happened weeks ago rather than hours, and I was amazed by how much our relationship had changed in such a short time. "I'm proud of you," Rebecca said suddenly, looking up from her legal pad. "For what?" "For being willing to reconsider. For admitting that maybe you didn't handle this perfectly the first time. For trusting me enough to let me be part of fixing it." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I should have trusted you from the beginning. I should have known that you'd want to be involved in something this important." "Well, to be fair, I never exactly expressed interest in charity work before. You had no way of knowing that I'd want to be involved. But I should have asked. I should have given you the option instead of making assumptions about what you'd want or how you'd react." Rebecca smiled. "We both made assumptions. I assumed you'd always include me in major decisions, and you assumed I wouldn't want to be included." Neither of us was communicating very clearly. She was right, and the realization made me think about all the other assumptions we had been making about each other over the years. How many conversations had we not had because we were both trying to protect each other from uncomfortable truth? How many opportunities for deeper connection had we missed because we were both so careful to avoid conflict? "I want to tell you about Maria Santos," I said impulsively, "and about all the other people I've met, who made me realize how much good this money could do." For the next 2 hours I told Rebecca stories about the people and organizations that had inspired my charitable giving. Maria, who was now in her final month of pregnancy and had completed her GAD with the help of tutoring provided by the community center, the literacy program that had helped a 60-year-old immigrant learn to read English well enough to pass his citizenship test, the after-school program that had kept a 12-year-old boy off the streets and helped him discover a talent for computer programming. Rebecca listened with the focused attention she brought to her most important business meetings, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes about the different organizations and their impact metric. I could see her mind working through the logistics of charitable giving. The same analytical skills she used in her consulting work now applied to social problems and community needs. "These are incredible stories," she said when I finished, "and I can see why you felt so urgently about wanting to help. But Mother, imagine how much more good you could do if you had someone helping you research organizations, evaluate programs, and develop long-term strategies for maximizing impact." "You mean like a professional foundation manager?" "I mean like a daughter who understands both business and charitable giving, who shares your values but might bring a different perspective to the work. Someone who could help you think through not just which organizations to support, but how to support them most effectively." I could hear the excitement building in her voice, and it reminded me of the way she used to sound when she was a child and had discovered something new that captured her imagination. She wasn't just being polite about my charitable interests. She was genuinely enthusiastic about the possibility of being involved. "You'd really want to do this?" I asked. "Leave your consulting practice to become a full-time philanthropist?" "I've been thinking about making a career change anyway. The corporate consulting world is exhausting, and a lot of the work feels meaningless. Helping companies optimize their profit margins doesn't exactly fill me with purpose. But this, helping people like Maria Santos and that 12-year-old computer programmer, this feels like something I could be passionate about." She paused, looking down at her notes. "Plus, it would give us a chance to work together on something that matters. We've never really collaborated on anything before, and I think it might be good for our relationship." I felt tears prick at my eyes as I realized that my impulsive decision to give away my money might have led to something I hadn't even known I wanted. A true partnership with my daughter, a shared mission that could bring us closer together while making a difference in other people's lives. "There's something else we need to discuss," I said, knowing that honesty required me to address the most difficult part of this conversation. "The business, Clark Industries. I know you said you always assumed it would be yours someday, and I need you to know that the foundation owns it now, legally, irrevocably." Rebecca nodded. "I know, and honestly I'm not sure I would have wanted to run a textile import business anyway. It's not exactly where my interests or expertise lie, but it represents security,
financial independence, the option to make your own choices about your career and your future. Mother, I already have financial independence. I've been successful in my own career, and I've saved and invested carefully. I'm not going to end up destitute just because you gave away your money to charity. She set down her legal pad and looked at me directly. What hurt wasn't losing the inheritance itself. What hurt was being excluded from the decision. It was feeling like you didn't trust me enough to tell me what you were thinking, or like you didn't value my opinion enough to ask for it. I understood then that the money had never really been the issue. The issue was respect, trust, inclusion, all the things that form the foundation of healthy family relationships and that I had damaged with my secrecy and unilateral decision-making. I'm sorry, I said again, and this time the words felt more adequate because they were accompanied by genuine understanding of what I was apologizing for. I know you are, and I forgive you, but Mother, we have to promise each other that we're going to communicate better going forward. No more secrets about health issues, or financial decisions, or anything else that affects both of us. No more trying to protect each other from difficult conversations. I nodded, knowing that this commitment would require me to change patterns of behavior that had developed over decades. I had spent so many years trying to shield Rebecca from worry, from uncertainty, from the harsh realities of business and finance and aging, that being completely honest with her felt foreign and risky. There is one more thing, I said, my heart racing, as I prepared to share the secret I had been keeping longest, about your father. Rebecca's eyebrows rose. What about him? The construction accident that killed him. It wasn't really an accident. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched Rebecca's face change as she processed what I had just told her. David's death had been the defining tragedy of both our lives, the loss that had shaped everything that came after. For 35 years, Rebecca had believed that her father had died in a random workplace accident, a victim of careless safety protocols and bad luck. What do you mean it wasn't an accident? I mean the company knew about the safety violation. They knew the scaffolding was unstable, they knew the workers weren't properly trained, and they chose to proceed with the project anyway, because fixing the problems would have delayed completion and cost them money. Rebecca was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that looked like anger. How long have you known this? Since about 6 months after he died. The lawyer who was handling the wrongful death lawsuit showed me the internal memos, the safety inspection reports, the testimony from other workers. It was clear that David's death was preventable, and you never told me. You were 3 years old, Rebecca. What was I supposed to tell you? That your father died because his employers valued profit more than worker safety, that the world is full of people who make decisions that hurt other people. You could have told me when I was older, when I was 10, or 15, or 20. You could have told me at some point in the last 35 years. She was right, of course. As Rebecca had grown older, there had been many opportunities to share the truth about her father's death, but I had kept the secret, first to protect her innocence, and later out of habit, out of a misguided desire to preserve her idealized memory of David, and to shield her from the anger and cynicism that knowledge of corporate negligence might create. I'm telling you now, I said weakly. Why now? Why, in the middle of everything else that's happened today, are you deciding to reveal this particular family secret? I thought about her question, trying to understand my own motivations. Why had I chosen this moment to finally tell Rebecca the truth about her father's death? Because I realized that I've been making the same mistake for 35 years. I've been deciding what you can handle, and what you can't, what you need to know and what you don't, what will help you, and I've been wrong every time. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades of secrecy lifting from my shoulders. David's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, Rebecca. It was an injustice, and the settlement money from the lawsuit was what allowed me to start Clark Industries. Everything I built, everything I achieved, everything I just gave away to charity, it all came from the money his employers paid to avoid taking responsibility for killing him. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, and I could see her mind working through the implications of what I had told her. The business she had grown up in, the success she had always admired, the financial security that had allowed her to pursue her own education and career, all of it was built on the foundation of her father's wrongful death. Is that why you gave it away? She asked finally. Because it felt like blood money, the question caught me off guard, but as soon as she asked it, I realized that she had identified something I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. Had my desire to give away my fortune been motivated, at least in part, by guilt about how that fortune had been acquired? I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe partly. I've never been able to enjoy the money without remembering what it cost. But I also genuinely believe that it can do more good, helping other people, than it would sitting in investment accounts, or being passed down to family members who already have everything they need. Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where emergency vehicles had been parked that morning. I watched her shoulders rise and fall as she breathed deeply, processing not just the revelation about her father, but everything else that had happened in this extraordinary day. I wish you had told me sooner, she said without turning around. About Dad, about your heart condition, about your plans for the money. I wish you had trusted me enough to let me be part of these decisions from the beginning. I wish I had too. She turned back to face me, and I could see tears in her eyes, but also something that looked like resolve. But I'm glad you're telling me now, and I'm glad we're going to figure out how to move forward together. She came back to the couch and sat down beside me, close enough that I could smell her perfume and see the faint lines around her eyes that reminded me that she wasn't the little girl I had been trying to protect all these years. Mother, I want you to promise me something.
What? I want you to promise that from now on, you'll treat me like an equal partner in this family. That means no more secrets, no more unilateral decisions, and no more trying to protect me from information you think might be too difficult for me to handle. I thought about what she was asking, about how fundamentally it would change the dynamic between us. For 35 years, I had been the protector, the decision maker, the one who shouldered burdens so that Rebecca wouldn't have to. She was asking me to give up that role, to trust her to be strong enough to handle whatever challenges we might face together. I promise, I said, and meant it. Good. Because there's a lot of work ahead of us. We need to figure out how to restructure the foundation governance, how to establish our partnership, how to evaluate the organizations you've already committed to supporting, and we need to have some difficult conversations about your health and your future care needs. The last part made my stomach clench with anxiety. I had been avoiding thinking about what would happen if my heart condition worsened, about who would make decisions for me if I became incapacitated, about how to maintain my independence while acknowledging my increasing vulnerability. One step at a time, I said. One step at a time, Rebecca agreed. But Mother, we're going to take those steps together. No more walking this path alone. Outside, the street was quiet except for the occasional car passing by and the distant sound of a dog barking. Inside my living room, surrounded by legal pads and takeout containers, and the debris of a day that had changed everything. Rebecca and I sat in comfortable silence, both of us exhausted by the emotional intensity of the last 12 hours, but also somehow energized by the possibilities that lay ahead. The foundation documents were still signed, the money was still transferred, and the legal complications were still formidable. But for the first time since this whole process began, I felt like I had made the right choice. Not the choice to give away my money, though I still believed in that, but the choice to trust my daughter with the truth about our family, our history, and our future. It was nearly midnight when Rebecca finally gathered her papers and prepared to leave. We hugged at the front door, and I was struck by how different this goodbye felt from all the careful, polite farewells we had exchanged over the years. "I'll call Jonathan first thing Monday morning," she said. "We'll set up a meeting to discuss the governance restructuring and the new foundation, and I'll call Dr. Martinez to schedule a follow-up appointment. I want you to come with me so you can hear directly from him about my prognosis and treatment options." Rebecca smiled. "I'd like that. And Mother, thank you for finally trusting me with the truth. All of it." I watched her drive away, then turned off the porch light and locked the door behind me. The house felt different somehow, lighter despite the weight of everything we had discussed. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying my secrets alone. As I got ready for bed, I thought about Maria Santos and her baby, about the literacy program and the after-school center, about all the people whose lives would be touched by the money I had given away. But I also thought about Rebecca, about the partnership we were building, about the work we would do together to make sure that money was used wisely and effectively. It wasn't the ending I had planned when I first decided to give away my fortune. It was better than it was a new beginning, built on honesty and trust, and the recognition that the most important legacy I could leave wasn't money at all. It was the relationship with my daughter that we were finally learning how to build. Monday morning arrived with the sharp clarity that often follows emotional storms, and I woke before dawn feeling more alert than I had in months. Rebecca had texted me at 6:30 to confirm our appointment with Jonathan at 10, followed by lunch with Dr. Martinez at 1:30. The efficiency of it reminded me that my daughter had inherited more than just my green eyes. She had also inherited my ability to transform crisis into action, chaos into manageable tasks. I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one I used to wear to important business meetings, and found myself applying makeup with more attention than I had bothered with in recent months. Today felt significant in a way that demanded respect, like the first day of a new job or the signing of a major contract. In many ways, that's exactly what it was. Jonathan's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Hartford, with tall windows overlooking the Connecticut River and walls lined with leather-bound legal volumes that probably cost more than most people's cars. He greeted us in his reception area, looking rested despite our late-night phone call, and ushered us into his conference room where he had spread out what appeared to be every document related to my foundation transfer. "I've been thinking about our conversation Friday night," he began without preamble, "and I believe we have several viable options for moving forward. None of them will completely undo what's been done, but all of them could address Rebecca's concerns about family involvement and long-term sustainability." Rebecca had brought her own legal pad and a digital recorder, which she placed on the polished conference table with Jonathan's permission. I watched her transform into the professional consultant she had trained herself to become, her posture straight, and her attention focused with laser intensity on the documents Jonathan was explaining. "The first option is the simplest," Jonathan continued, pointing to a flowchart he had apparently created over the weekend. "We modify the existing foundation's board structure to include Rebecca as a voting member and establish family consultation requirements for major decisions. This would require approval from the current board, but since Winnie is currently the sole voting member, that shouldn't be problematic." "What would that look like practically?" Rebecca asked, her pen poised over her note. "Essentially, it would mean that any grant over a certain dollar amount, say $100,000, would require unanimous board approval. Any major strategic decisions about the foundation's direction would need to be discussed with family members before implementation, and there would be regular reporting requirements to ensure transparency." I found myself nodding as Jonathan explained the details. This felt like a structure that could honor both my desire for charitable impact and Rebecca's need to be included in decisions that affected our family legacy. "The second option is more complex, but potentially more flexible," Jonathan continued, moving to a different section of his flowchart. "We establish a separate but complementary foundation, jointly managed by you and Rebecca, funded with the assets you retained, plus any additional contributions Rebecca might want to make. This would give you both a fresh start with shared decision-making from the beginning." Rebecca looked up from her notes. Would the two foundations coordinate their activities, or would they operate independently? "That would be up to you. They could focus on different charitable areas, or they could work together on shared initiatives. The advantage of this approach is that it doesn't require any modifications to the existing legal structure, so there's no risk of challenging the original transfers." "And the third option?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what he was going to say. "The third option is to pursue a legal challenge to the original transfers, based on inadequate family consultation and potential modifications to better serve the charitable intent. This would be the most complicated route, but it might also provide the most flexibility for restructuring everything from scratch." The room was quiet for a moment, as we all considered the implications of what Jonathan had outlined. Each option represented a different balance between honoring my original intentions and accommodating Rebecca's legitimate concerns about being excluded from major family decisions. "I don't want to challenge the transfers," I said finally. "Those organizations are counting on that money, and some of them have already begun implementing programs based on the commitments I made. Pulling that funding away now would cause real harm to people who need help. Rebecca nodded approvingly. I agree. The charitable mission should be protected. But I do think we need to establish better governance structures going forward. So we're looking at option 1 or option 2, Jonathan said, making notes on his legal pad. Board modification or dual foundations. Could we do both? Rebecca asked. Modify the existing foundation to include family oversight, and also establish a new foundation for ongoing partnership. Jonathan raised his eyebrows. That's an interesting approach. It would provide multiple layers of family involvement and could create different vehicles for different types of charitable giving, but it would also be more complex to manage and potentially more expensive to maintain. I looked at Rebecca, trying to gauge her enthusiasm for what sounded like a significant commitment of time and energy. Are you really prepared to take on that level of involvement? Running one foundation is a full-time job, and you're talking about essentially creating and managing a second one. Mother, I've been thinking about this all weekend. The consulting practice has been profitable, but it hasn't been fulfilling. I've been looking for an opportunity to do something that feels more meaningful, more connected to values I actually care about. This could be exactly the career change I've been needing. There was something in her voice that reminded me of my own excitement when I first started Clark Industries, the sense of building something important from the ground up. I had worried that Rebecca would see charitable work as a burden or an obligation, but she seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the possibilities. What about the financial aspects? I asked. Foundation management doesn't typically pay the kind of salary you're used to earning. I've saved enough to live comfortably for several years without any salary at all, and if the foundations grow and become more complex, we could establish reasonable compensation for professional management. But honestly, money isn't the primary motivation here. Jonathan was taking notes as we talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions about our vision for the partnership and our expectations for charitable impact. By the end of the hour, we had outlined a structure that felt both ambitious and achievable. The existing Clark Foundation would be modified to include Rebecca as co-director and would focus on the organizations I had already committed to supporting. A new foundation, tentatively called the Clark Family Foundation, would be established with equal contributions from both of us, and would focus on emerging needs and innovative programs. Both foundations would be governed by shared decision-making principles, with major grants requiring approval from both co-directors. I'll draft the necessary paperwork this week, Jonathan said as we prepared to leave. The board modification for the existing foundation should be straightforward, and I can have incorporation documents for the new foundation ready by Friday. As we walked to our cars in the parking garage, Rebecca linked her arm through mine in a gesture that felt both casual and significant. How are you feeling about all this? Nervous, I admitted, but also excited. I've been making decisions alone for so long that the idea of having a true partner feels both wonderful and terrifying. I'm nervous too. I've never managed a charitable foundation before, and I'm going to have to learn an entirely new field. But Mother, I think this could be something really special. Not just the charitable work itself, but the chance for us to build something together. We had lunch at a small Italian restaurant near Dr. Martinez's office, and I found myself studying Rebecca's face as she talked about her ideas for foundation programming. There was an animation in her expression that I hadn't seen in years, a sense of purpose and excitement that reminded me why I had worked so hard to build financial security for our family in the first place. I've been thinking about your story about Maria Santos, she said over her pasta primavera, the pregnant teenager trying to finish her GED while working 2 jobs. There have to be thousands of young women in similar situations, and most of them probably don't have access to the kind of support programs that helped her. That's exactly what I was thinking when I decided to fund the community center, I said. One success story multiplied by better resources and more comprehensive support. But what if we could do more than just fund existing programs? What if we could help create new models for supporting young parents in education and career development? What if we could pilot innovative approaches and then help other organizations replicate them? I could see Rebecca's mind working through the possibilities, applying the same strategic thinking she brought to corporate consulting to the challenges of social change. This was why I had wanted her involved from the beginning. even though I hadn't been able to articulate it at the time. She didn't just want to write checks to worthy causes. She wanted to understand problems systematically and develop solutions that could create lasting change. Have you thought about what this might mean for your relationship with David? I asked, using the name she had called her father since childhood. Learning that his death is what made our wealth possible. Rebecca set down her fork and looked at me direct. I've been thinking about that a lot, actually. At first I felt angry that you never told me. Then I felt guilty about benefiting from something so tragic. But now I think I'm starting to see it differently. How so? Dad's death was a terrible injustice. The company that killed him faced no real consequences except paying money to make the problem go away. But what you did with that money, building a business, creating jobs, providing for our family, and now funding programs that help other people, that transforms the tragedy into something meaningful. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I can't bring Dad back or undo the corporate negligence that killed him, but I can use the resources that came from his death to prevent other tragedies, to help other families, to create the kind of positive change that honors his memory. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I listened to Rebecca reframe our family history in a way that transformed guilt into purpose. She was right, of course. David's death had been senseless and preventable, but the foundation work we were planning could give that loss meaning by helping other people avoid similar tragedies. I think your father would be proud of what we're planning, I said softly. I think so too. And Mother, I think he would be proud of you for having the courage to give away your fortune and for trusting me enough to be your partner in using it wisely. Doc Martinez's office was busy when we arrived for our 1:30 appointment, filled with patients of various ages dealing with various stages of cardiac care. I watched Rebecca observe the waiting room with the same analytical attention she had brought to Jonathan's office, and I wondered what conclusions she was drawing about my medical situation based on the people around us. Doc Martinez greeted us both warmly and ushered us into his private office, where Rebecca immediately pulled out her legal pad and asked if she could take notes. I could see him suppressing a smile as he nodded his agreement, clearly recognizing the family resemblance in our shared preference for documentation and preparation. Clark has asked me to share her medical information with you, he began. So let me start by explaining exactly what we're dealing with and what the prognosis looks like. For the next 30 minutes, Dr. Martinez walked Rebecca through my cardiac evaluation results, explaining the blockages in my coronary arteries, the medications I was taking, and the lifestyle modifications he had recommended. He was thorough but not alarming, emphasizing that while my condition was serious, it was also manageable with proper care. What about surgery? Rebecca asked. Are we looking at bypass surgery or angioplasty? Not immediately. Ms. Clark's blockages are significant, but they're not at the level where surgical intervention is urgently required. We're monitoring the situation closely, and if the blockages worsen or if she develops additional symptoms, we'll reassess surgical options. And what should I watch for? Rebecca asked. What symptoms would indicate that her condition is deteriorating? Dr. Martinez handed her a printed information sheet that outlined warning signs and emergency indicators. I watched her study it with the same intensity she had brought to the foundation documents, and I realized that this was how Rebecca processed fear, by gathering information, asking questions, and creating plans for managing whatever challenges might arise. The most important thing, Dr. Martinez concluded, is that Mrs. Clark continues taking her medications as prescribed, maintains regular follow-up appointments, and doesn't ignore symptoms if they develop. Stress management is also crucial, as emotional stress can significantly impact cardiac health. Rebecca looked up from her notes. What about her decision to give away her fortune and establish charitable foundations? Would that level of activity be problematic from a stress perspective? That depends on how she approaches it. If she's constantly worried about financial security or overwhelmed by the complexity of foundation management, that could be harmful. But if the charitable work gives her a sense of purpose and satisfaction, it could actually be beneficial for her overall health. And having a partner in the foundation work? I asked. Someone to share the decision-making and management responsibilities. That sounds ideal from a stress management perspective. Social support and shared responsibility are generally very positive for cardiac patients. As we left Martinez's office,
I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't expected. Having Rebecca fully informed about my medical situation eliminated the exhausting burden of secrecy I had been carrying, but it also meant that I would have support and advocacy if my condition worsened in the future. "I want to come to your next appointment," Rebecca said as we walked to our cars. "I want to establish a relationship with Dr. Martinez, so that if there's ever an emergency or if you need someone to help communicate with your medical team, I'll already be familiar with your case." The thoughtfulness of this request touched me deeply. Rebecca wasn't just offering to be informed about my health, she was offering to be my partner in managing it, to take on the role of advocate and supporter that I had been handling alone. "I'd like that," I said simply. "Good. And Mother, I want you to promise me that you'll tell me immediately if you experience any symptoms or if you're worried about anything related to your health. No more protecting me from medical information." I thought about the pattern of secrecy that had nearly destroyed our relationship, about how my desire to shield Rebecca from worry had instead created much bigger problems for both of us. "I promise," I said, and meant it. That evening, Rebecca came to my house for dinner, bringing takeout from the Thai restaurant we both loved, and a bottle of wine to celebrate our new partnership. We spread the foundation documents across my dining room table and began the process of translating our morning's legal discussions into practical action plans. "I think we should visit the community center where you met Maria Santos," Rebecca said, making notes in the margins of the organizational charts Jonathan had provided. "I want to see the programs in action and meet some of the people who are benefiting from your fund. I'd love to show you around. Maria should have had her baby by now, and I've been wanting to check on how she's doing with the transition back to work, and I think we should schedule site visits to all the organizations the Clark Foundation is supporting. I need to understand their programs, their leadership, their impact metrics, and their long-term sustainability plan." I watched Rebecca create a systematic approach to foundation management, bringing the same methodical thinking to charitable giving that had made her successful in corporate consulting. But there was something different in her approach now, a sense of personal investment that went beyond professional competence. "Rebecca," I said during a pause in our planning, "what made you decide you wanted to be involved in this work? Really involved, not just supportive from a distance?" She looked up from her notes, considering the question seriously. "I think it was listening to you talk about Maria Santos and the other people you've met. You weren't just describing charity cases or tax deductions, you were talking about real people whose lives were being changed by access to resources and opportunities." She paused, twirling her pen between her fingers. "In my consulting work, I've spent years helping companies maximize profits and improve efficiency. The work was intellectually challenging, but it never felt like it mattered in any meaningful way. Even when we saved companies millions of dollars or streamlined operations, the impact was always abstract. And this feels different. This feels like it could actually change people's lives. Like the work we do could determine whether someone like Maria Santos has the support she needs to complete her education and build a career, or whether she ends up trapped in poverty because the resources weren't available when she needed them." Rebecca set down her pen and looked at me direct. "Mother, you've given me an opportunity to use my skills for something that actually matters, to be part of something bigger than profit margins and corporate restructuring. That's a gift I didn't even know I wanted until you offered it to me." The gratitude in her voice made me realize that my decision to give away my fortune hadn't just created opportunities for charitable impact, it had also created an opportunity for Rebecca to find more meaningful work, to align her professional skills with her personal values in a way she had never been able to do before. "I'm glad," I said simply.
"And I'm grateful that you're willing to be my partner in this." We worked until nearly midnight, creating timelines for foundation restructuring, developing criteria for evaluating new charitable opportunities, and beginning to draft policies for grant making and program evaluation. By the time Rebecca left, we had transformed our relationship crisis into a comprehensive business plan for collaborative philanthropy. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 4 days. The woman who had secretly signed away her fortune on Friday morning was now planning a charitable partnership with her daughter, one built on transparency, shared decision-making, and mutual respect. The foundation documents were still signed, the money was still transferred, and the legal structures were still being modified. But everything else had changed. My relationship with Rebecca was stronger and more honest than it had ever been. My charitable giving was becoming more strategic and sustainable, and my own sense of purpose was expanding to include not just philanthropic impact, but also the possibility of meaningful collaboration with the person I loved most in the world. I fell asleep that night, thinking about Maria Santos and her new baby, about the literacy program and the after-school center, about all the people whose lives would be touched by the money I had given away. But I also thought about Rebecca, about the work we would do together, about the legacy we would build that was richer and more complex than anything I could have created alone. The crisis that had started with a misunderstood letter had become the foundation for something I hadn't even known I wanted, a true partnership with my daughter, built on honesty and trust and shared commitment to making the world a little bit better than we found it. Tuesday morning brought a phone call that would test the strength of our newly formed partnership, before we had even finished establishing it. I was in my kitchen making coffee when Rebecca called, her voice tight with stress and exhaustion. "Mother, I need you to sit down. There's something I have to tell you, and it's going to be difficult to hear." My first thought was that something had happened to her, a car accident, a medical emergency, some crisis that would derail all the plans we had made the night before. But her next words revealed a different kind of disaster entirely. "I got a call this morning from someone named Michael Patterson. He says he's a reporter with the Hartford Business Journal, and he's working on a story about your charitable giving. Apparently, someone contacted him with concerns about your mental competency and the circumstances surrounding the foundation transfers." I felt the coffee mug slip from my hands, shattering against the kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic and hot liquid. The emergency response on Friday morning, the neighbors who had seen the paramedics and police cars, the public nature of what should have been a private family crisis, all of it was about to become front-page news. "How much does he know?" I asked, reaching for paper towels to clean up the mess I had made. "Too much. He knows about the foundation, about the amount of the transfer, about the emergency response on Friday. He's asking questions about whether you were under duress when you signed the documents, whether there are family disputes about the charitable giving, whether the organizations receiving funding have been properly vetted." I closed my eyes, imagining the headlines that could destroy both my reputation and the credibility of the organizations I was trying to support. Wealthy widow's mental health crisis leads to questionable charitable giving. Family disputes foundation transfer, as daughter questions mother's competency. The possibilities were endless and uniformly devastating. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. I told him I would need to consult with you and with our attorney before making any statement. But mother, he's already spoken with other people. He has quotes from neighbors about the emergency vehicles, and he's apparently been in contact with someone who claims to have inside information about our family situation." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Someone who knew about our private crisis, someone who had access to information about the emergency response and the family conflicts, had decided to use that knowledge to create a public scandal. The list of people who could have provided that information was disturbingly short. "I'm calling Jonathan," I said, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. "And then I'm calling you back. Don't speak to any reporters until we've figured out how to handle this." Jonathan answered on the first ring, which told me that he had probably already received his own calls from the Hartford Business Journal. His voice was calm but concerned as he confirmed my worst fears. "I've been fielding inquiries since 8 o'clock this morning. They have most of the basic facts about the foundation transfer, and they're asking pointed questions about the timing, the family dynamics, and the emergency response. Someone has definitely been talking to them. Can we stop the story from running? Not unless there are factual errors we can dispute. But we can try to shape the narrative by providing our own statement about the foundation's mission and the collaborative approach you and Rebecca are developing. What about the mental competency angle? Can we address those concerns directly? We can provide documentation of your capacity at the time of signing, including my own professional assessment and the evaluation from the crisis counselor on Friday. But the perception of instability may be more damaging than the legal reality. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest that I recognized as stress-induced cardiac symptoms, and I forced myself to breathe slowly and deeply as Dr. Martinez had taught me. The irony wasn't lost on me that the stress of defending my mental competency might trigger the very health problems that could be used to question my judgment. Jonathan, I need you to arrange a meeting with this reporter. Rebecca and I will provide a joint statement about the foundation work and our partnership. We'll be completely transparent about the family dynamics and the collaborative approach we're developing. Are you sure that's why? Sometimes it's better to let these stories run their course without adding fuel to the fire. The story is going to run regardless, but if we control the narrative, if we present a united front, and demonstrate that this is a thoughtful, strategic approach to charitable giving, rather than an impulsive decision by a confused old woman, we might be able to minimize the damage. I called Rebecca back and outlined my plan for dealing with the media attention. She was quiet for a long moment before responding, and I could hear the weight of what I was asking her to do. Mother, if we give a joint interview, if we present ourselves as partners in this foundation work, there's no going back. It will be public knowledge that I've left my consulting practice to become a full-time philanthropist. It will affect my professional reputation and my future career options. I know what I'm asking of you, I said, and if you're not ready to make that commitment, I understand. You could distance yourself from the foundation work until this media attention dies down. That's not what I'm worried about, Rebecca said firmly. I'm worried about you facing this alone, about reporters and neighbors and business associates, questioning your judgment and your mental health. I'm worried about the organizations you're supporting being tainted by association with controversy. Her concern for my well-being and for the charitable mission touched me deeply, but it also reminded me that this crisis was bigger than just our family reputation. The community center where Maria Santos had received support, the literacy program that had helped adult learners achieve their goals, the after-school program that provided safe spaces for children. All of these organizations could be damaged by association with a scandal. Then we face it together, I said. We present a united front, we explain our mission clearly and convincingly, and we demonstrate that this foundation work is the result of careful planning and shared values, rather than impulsive decision-making. All right, Rebecca said after another pause. Let's do it. But Mother, we need to be completely prepared. We need talking points, we need documentation, and we need to present a professional, competent image that leaves no room for questions about our judgment or our partnership. She was right, of course. If we were going to take control of this narrative, we needed to do it with the same strategic thinking and thorough preparation that we brought to all our other important business decisions. Come over this afternoon. We'll spend the evening preparing for the interview and making sure we're ready to defend everything we've done and everything we're planning to do. As I hung up the phone, I realized that our new partnership was about to face its first major test under the worst possible circumstance. Public scrutiny, media attention, and professional skepticism would either strengthen our collaboration or reveal weaknesses that could destroy both our relationship and our charitable mission. But for the first time since this crisis began, I wasn't facing it alone. Rebecca and I would handle this challenge together, just as we had promised each other we would handle all future challenges. And that partnership, built on honesty and trust and shared commitment to doing good in the world, was strong enough to survive whatever questions or criticisms might come our way. The foundation documents were still signed, the money was still transferred, and the media attention was still threatening. But Rebecca and I were no longer just mother and daughter navigating a family crisis. We were business partners defending a shared mission, and that made all the difference. The Hartford Business Journal's conference room felt like a courtroom as Rebecca and I took our seats, across from Michael Patterson, a thin man in his early 40s with the kind of sharp eyes that suggested he was accustomed to finding inconsistencies in people's stories. Jonathan sat beside us, his briefcase filled with documentation that we hoped would counter whatever narrative Patterson was planning to construct. Patterson placed a digital recorder on the table between us and smiled with professional courtesy that didn't reach his eye. Thank you both for agreeing to this interview, I want to assure you that my goal is simply to present an accurate picture of the Clark Foundation and the circumstances surrounding its establishment. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and professional. Before we begin, Miss Patterson, I'd like to understand the source of your information about our family's private medical and legal matters. Some of what you've described to us constitutes a significant breach of confidentiality. I protect my sources, Miss Clark, but I can tell you that multiple individuals have expressed concerns about the timing and circumstances of your mother's charitable giving, particularly in light of the emergency response at her residence last Friday. I felt my jaw tighten at his phrasing, the way he made it sound like I had been rescued from some desperate act rather than subjected to my daughter's well-intentioned but misguided panic. But Rebecca had coached me on staying calm, on presenting facts rather than emotions, on demonstrating competence through measured responses rather than defensive reaction. Patterson, I said evenly, the emergency response was the result of a communication breakdown between my daughter and myself, not a mental health crisis. I had established a charitable foundation and neglected to inform Rebecca of my plans before she discovered the legal document. Her concern for my well-being led her to call for professional evaluation, which quickly determined that there was no crisis and no cause for alarm. But surely you can understand how the circumstances might appear troubling to outside observers. A 72-year-old woman secretly gives away $47 million without consulting family members, writes what could be interpreted as a farewell letter, and requires emergency intervention when the plan is discovered. Rebecca's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. Mr. Patterson, what you're describing as secretive and troubling behavior is actually a well-documented approach to charitable giving. Many philanthropists prefer to finalize their giving plans before announcing them publicly or discussing them with family members. The so-called farewell letter was actually a standard disclosure document explaining the rationale for charitable transfer. She reached into her folder and produced copies of similar letters from other high-profile charitable donors, documents that Jonathan had helped us locate that demonstrated the routine nature of such communication. Moreover, Rebecca continued, the emergency response lasted less than 2 hours and concluded with professional confirmation that my mother was competent, rational, and acting within her legal rights. The only crisis was a temporary misunderstanding between family members, which has since been resolved through improved communication. Patterson examined the documents Rebecca had provided, clearly disappointed that his crisis narrative was being systematically dismantled by evidence and professional testimony, but he wasn't ready to abandon his story entirely. What about concerns from business associates and community members who question whether Mrs. Clark received adequate professional guidance before making such significant financial commitment? This was the opening we had been preparing for, the chance to demonstrate that my charitable giving wasn't impulsive or poorly planned, but rather the result of months of careful research and professional consultation. Patterson, I worked with attorney Jonathan Reeves for over 6 months to structure the foundation appropriately. I consulted with financial advisors, tax specialists, and nonprofit management experts. I personally visited every organization that received funding, met with their leadership teams, and reviewed their programming and impact data. Jonathan leaned forward to add his professional credibility to my statement. I can confirm that Ms. Clark's foundation planning was thorough and methodical. She asked detailed questions about legal structures, tax implications, and long-term sustainability. Her decision-making process was entirely consistent with that of other sophisticated donors I've represented. And what about the family dynamics? Patterson pressed. Ms. Clark, how do you respond to suggestions that your mother's charitable giving represents a rejection of family responsibility or an attempt to disinherit you? Rebecca's answer was immediate and emphatic. Those suggestions are completely false. My mother's charitable giving represents a commitment to values we both share, using resources to help people who need assistance, creating opportunities for education and economic advancement, and leaving a positive legacy that extends beyond our immediate family. She paused, and I could see her shifting into the mode she used when presenting to corporate boards, confident and compelling. In fact, I've left my consulting practice to become co-director of the foundation work. This isn't a case of family conflict over inheritance, it's a case of family collaboration to maximize charitable impact. My mother and I are partners in this mission, combining her resources with my professional skills to ensure that every dollar donated creates meaningful change in people's lives. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised by this revelation. He had come into the interview expecting to document family conflict and questionable decision-making, but Rebecca was presenting him with a story of partnership and shared purpose. Can you elaborate on this partnership? What does your role as co-director entail? For the next 30 minutes, Rebecca outlined our governance structure, our site visit schedule, our grant evaluation criteria, and our plans for expanding the foundation's impact through strategic partnerships with other organizations. She spoke with the kind of detailed knowledge and professional competence that made it impossible to question either her commitment or her qualifications. We're not just writing checks to worthy causes, she explained. We're developing relationships with organizations that share our values, providing ongoing support and guidance, and helping them build sustainable programs that will continue making a difference long after our initial grants are expended. I watched Patterson's expression change as he realized that his story about an unstable elderly woman making questionable financial decisions was being replaced by a story about strategic philanthropy and intergenerational collaboration. This wasn't the kind of scandal that would sell newspapers or generate online clicks. Mr. Patterson, I said during a pause in Rebecca's presentation, I understand that controversy makes for more interesting journalism than partnership and careful planning. But the real story here isn't about family conflict or mental health concerns. It's about how one family decided to use its resources to address problems in our community, and how that decision brought us closer together rather than driving us apart. What problems specifically are you addressing? Rebecca and I spent the remainder of the interview describing our funding priorities, supporting young parents like Maria Santos, who needed educational assistance, expanding literacy programs for adult learners, strengthening after-school programming in underserved neighborhoods, and developing innovative approaches to poverty reduction that could be replicated in other communities. We had photographs from our site visits, testimonials from program participants, and data demonstrating the measurable impact of our grants. By the time we finished, Patterson was taking notes about charitable programs rather than family dysfunction. One final question, Patterson said as he prepared to turn off his recorder. Mrs. Clark, do you have any regrets about your decision to give away your fortune? Any concerns about your financial security or your family's future? I thought about the question seriously, knowing that my answer would likely be the quote that defined how this story was ultimately presented to the public. Mr. Patterson, I spent 43 years building a business and accumulating wealth, and I'm proud of what I accomplished. But I've spent the last few months learning about people and organizations that are solving real problems with limited resources, and I've discovered that money has much more power to create positive change than I ever realized when I was simply accumulating. I paused, looking at Rebecca, who smiled encouragingly. My only regret is that I waited so long to start this work, and that I initially tried to do it without involving my daughter. The partnership Rebecca and I have developed is more rewarding than anything I achieved in business, and the impact we're having on people's lives is more satisfying than any profit I ever earned. After Patterson left, the three of us sat in the conference room reviewing how the interview had gone. Jonathan was optimistic that we had successfully reframed the narrative, but he warned us that we wouldn't know how the story would be presented until it was published. The important thing is that you presented a united front, he said. You demonstrated competence, partnership, and clear charitable intent. Whatever spin Patterson puts on the story, readers will see that this is a family working together rather than fighting each other. Rebecca gathered her notes and looked at me with something that might have been pride. Mother, you were amazing in there. You stayed calm, you stuck to the facts, and you made it clear that this foundation work is the result of careful planning rather than impulsive decision-making. We were amazing, I corrected her.
I couldn't have handled that interview without your support and your professional presentation of our partnership. The article appeared in the Hartford Business Journal 3 days later, with the headline, Local Businesswoman Partners with Daughter in Major Charitable Initiative. The story focused on our collaborative approach to philanthropy, our strategic grant-making process, and the positive impact our funding was already having on community organizations. Patterson had included a brief mention of the emergency response and the initial family communication breakdown, but he presented it as context for how we had developed our partnership rather than as evidence of mental instability or family conflict. The overall tone was respectful and professional, emphasizing our shared commitment to charitable work rather than sensationalizing our personal crisis. More importantly, the article included quotes from leaders at the organizations we were supporting, testimonials from program participants, and data demonstrating the measurable impact of our grant. Maria Santos was featured prominently, describing how educational support had helped her complete her GED and transition into a career that could support her growing family. I never expected to see my story in the newspaper, Maria told us when we visited the community center the following week. But I'm grateful that people will know about the programs here and maybe other young mothers will get the help they need. Rebecca spent that entire visit taking detailed notes about program operations, asking questions about resource needs, and developing relationships with staff members and participants. I watched her transform from corporate consultant to hands-on philanthropist, and I realized that my impulsive decision to give away my fortune had created something much more valuable than charitable impact. It had created a new relationship with my daughter, one built on shared values, mutual respect and collaborative work toward goals that mattered to both of us. The next few months passed in a blur of site visits, board meetings, grant evaluations, and strategic planning sessions. Rebecca officially resigned from her consulting practice and threw herself into foundation management with the same intensity and attention to detail that had made her successful in corporate work. We developed evaluation criteria for potential grantees, established reporting requirements for funded organizations, and created systems for tracking the long-term impact of our charitable investment. But more than that, we developed a working relationship that was both professional and personal, built on the kind of honest communication that had been missing from our family dynamic for too many years. I never realized how much I needed this, Rebecca told me one evening as we reviewed applications for our next round of grants. Not just the meaningful work, but the chance to really collaborate with you on something important. I never realized how much better this work could be with a true partner, I replied, someone who shares the mission but brings different skills and perspectives to achieving it. 6 months after the crisis that had started with a misunderstood letter, Rebecca and I stood together at the community center, where Maria Santos was graduating from a nursing assistant program we had helped fund. Maria's baby daughter was sleeping peacefully in her car seat, and Maria herself was wearing scrubs with the logo of the local hospital where she would begin working the following week. "Thank you," Maria said when she saw us in the audience, "both of you. This program changed my life, and knowing that someone believed in me enough to invest in my education, that made all the difference." I felt tears in my eyes as I watched this young woman who had been struggling to finish her GED just months earlier preparing to begin a career that would provide stability and opportunity for her family. This was what I had hoped for when I first decided to give away my fortune, the chance to transform individual lives and create ripple effects that would benefit entire communities. But what I hadn't anticipated was how much the work would transform my own life and my relationship with Rebecca. We had become true partners, combining our resources and skills to create something neither of us could have achieved alone. "What's next?" Rebecca asked as we drove home from the graduation ceremony. "I've been thinking about that," I said. "There's a need for affordable housing in the downtown area, and I've been wondering if we could develop a model that combines housing assistance with educational programming and job training, like a comprehensive community development approach." "Exactly. Something that addresses multiple barriers to economic stability rather than just providing temporary assistance." Rebecca was already pulling out her phone to make notes, her mind immediately jumping to the research and planning that would be required to develop such a program. "It would be complex," she said, but it could also be incredibly impactful if we design it correctly. We'd need to partner with housing developers, social service agencies, educational institutions and local employers. Are you interested in taking on something that complicates? Rebecca looked at me with the kind of enthusiasm I had seen in her face when she first described her vision for strategic philanthropy. Mother, I can't think of anything I'd rather spend the next few years working on, but only if we're doing it together. Together, I agreed, and the word carried all the weight of our new partnership, our shared commitment to making a difference, and our recognition that the best legacies are built through collaboration rather than individual achievement. The foundation documents were still signed, the money was still transferred, and the legal structures were still evolving to accommodate our partnership. But everything else had changed in ways I could never have anticipated when I first decided to give away my fortune. I had gained a true partner in my daughter, a sense of purpose that extended beyond personal success, and the satisfaction of knowing that our family's resources were being used to create opportunities for people who needed them most. The crisis that had started with emergency vehicles and accusations of mental illness had become the foundation for something much more valuable than money, a relationship built on honesty, trust, and shared commitment to making the world a little bit better than we found. As we planned our next initiatives and dreamed about the impact we could have on our community, I realized that the best charitable gift I had ever made wasn't the $47 million I had given away. It was the decision to include Rebecca as my partner in using that money wisely, and the trust that had grown between us as we learned to work together toward goals that mattered to both of us. The woman who had written that misunderstood letter on a quiet Friday morning had been trying to do good in the world while protecting her family from difficult conversations. The woman and daughter who now sat in my living room planning their next charitable initiative had learned that the most powerful force for positive change isn't money at all, it's the relationships we build with the people we love, and the work we do together to create a legacy that will outlast us both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.